Welcome to the Rocket PD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of Rocket PD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
I think everything I do in terms of my work is about trying to help teachers release control. So often in classrooms, it is the teacher who is controlling the curriculum and how it's delivered. They're controlling the pace of the experience because they're under a lot of pressure to cover a lot of content.
Dr. Catlin Tucker is a best-selling author, former Teacher of the Year, and expert on all things UDL and blended learning. On this episode of the Rocket PD Podcast, I asked Dr. Tucker, fresh off a recent TED Talk in which she implores educators to reimagine traditional classroom education, what it looks and feels like when we put students at the center of their learning.
When we exert a lot of control on learners, we actually negatively impact their motivation over time because as human beings, one of the kind of psychological needs we have to be motivated is a degree of autonomy. Is it that need for agency in the learning environment? And as long as we are controlling everything, we're also doing the lion's share of the work. We're not giving students the opportunity to really be those active agents in a learning experience. And so for me, we talk about reimagining education.
Like her response? Stick around until the end. She details a group she's bringing together later in the year to learn and model effective blended learning practices in K-12 classrooms. All right, well, Catlin, so good to have you. I know kind of like bucket list item for you, right? I just saw the TED Talk in Folsom. Tell me a little bit about that experience. I loved hearing you talk about reimagining education. I loved hearing you talk about, and we're going to get into it a little bit more, this whole idea of what a student-led education looks like. But I haven't talked to you in a while, and I know you just did this, and I'd love to hear just what was that experience like?
It was wild. I have had a TED Talk on my bucket list since, I've always loved watching them. And then when I went into my doctoral program, the weekend before we actually started classes, it was a whole big orientation. And one of the homework assignments was to create a vision board. And I had a couple different things or a few different things on my vision board. And the TEDx talk was one of them. And so that was the last one that I hadn't done. So it was very exciting finally now, 6 years later to be able to do it and to take the stage with just an incredible collection of people with great ideas. Although I will say, landing a talk in the era of AI exploding in education when your talk isn't explicitly about AI was a bit of a challenge.
Not the easiest thing to do, right? Well, I have to tell you, I watched it from start to finish. I loved it. I thought it must be a little intimidating to be up there as you are on the stage, kind of, all alone in front of a group of people. And I know you speak all the time, but when this is something that you've wanted to do for a long time, and there's a little pressure with that TEDx brand, I'm sure it was a lot of preparation. Yeah.
No, it's funny. I have spoken in front of thousands and thousands of people before, but there was only 800 people in the TED auditorium, but it was a different level of just stress. And when I give a keynote, it's 60 minutes and I have my slides and I'm not memorizing things word for word. And with a TED Talk, it's you don't have hardly any time. So I have to cram this message into 13 or 14 minutes. And it was definitely high intensity kind of endeavor, but just could not be more honored to have had that opportunity.
Very cool. Well, I won't talk some more about it, but just so you know, I had this up on my screen and I don't know if you've looked at this, but you have 5,500 likes of your TED Talk. So people are watching, and it's not just me. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I know, the title was Reimagine Education, Shifting Towards Student-Led Learning. This is something that you and I have talked about quite a bit, the challenge that educators have in engaging students in the new ways that they learn and really putting students at the center of their education in order to do that, becoming more of a facilitator, someone who works with students as opposed to talks at them. You said something really cool in your TED Talk that I wrote down, right? And it said, to make that shift happen, we need to pass the baton of control from the teacher to the learner. I just love that. And I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about, what the inspiration for that.
Yeah, I think everything I do in terms of my work is about trying to help teachers release control. So often in classrooms, it is the teacher who is controlling the curriculum and how it's delivered. They're controlling the pace of the experience because they're under a lot of pressure to cover a lot of content, and they're wanting to control classroom management and behaviors. But when we exert a lot of control on learners, we actually negatively impact their motivation over time. Because as human beings, one of the kind of psychological needs we have to be motivated is a degree of autonomy. Is it that need for agency in the learning environment? And as long as we are controlling everything, we're also doing the lion's share of the work. We're not giving students the opportunity to really be those active agents in a learning experience. And so for me, when we talk about reimagining education, the purpose of that is to help educators find more rewarding, sustainable ways to do this work that light them up, that allow them to spend their finite time and energy on the aspects of this work that they enjoy most, while also cultivating learners who are confident and resilient. And neither of those things are going to happen if we're not willing to release some of the control. And I think a good part of the reason why so many students report negative feelings about school is because outside of school, they're a streaming culture of kids, right? They have total control over their experience, especially their digital experience. And then they come into classrooms that I say in the talk, they function like network television, right? Everybody's in the same room at the same time, getting the same thing, whether they like it or not, whether they need it or not, whether it's a pace that works for them or not. And it just creates a lot of challenges when we're unwilling to really share the responsibility for learning with the students in our classrooms.
Now, you're a former teacher of the year, but I've heard you tell this story before. You almost quit teaching. This discovery of blended learning led you on a discovery that kept you in the game. And I know we've heard so much about teachers struggling right now, teachers being stressed, teachers just not feeling like they have the agency and the empowerment to do great things in the classroom with kids. Talk to me a little bit about, your personal journey and how you got here and what blended learning has done for you.
Absolutely. And let me just say, I started this career very much the way I was taught as a student, right? I wrote the agenda on the board. It was a one lesson for the whole class. And then I just marched everybody through it. And it took about 5 years of that for me to think, oh my goodness, I have made an enormous mistake coming into education. This is not what I thought I was signing up for. I had imagined this vibrant classroom full of discussions and eager and excited students. And that was not my reality. And I remember going on maternity leave and I had like 1 year off of school. And then to supplement my income, I was teaching online college writing classes. And I never met my students face to face. And yet I felt like I knew them. And I started to get intrigued by the potential of technology in this kind of learning equation. And so when I went back to school, I really went with kind of this attitude of, I don't have anything to lose. If I can't turn this ship around this year, I'm leaving anyway. Yeah. So I'm just going to treat this classroom like a laboratory and try new things. And what was fascinating and what I share with teachers is at that point, I had one Chromebook. I wrote a series of donors choose projects to get 10 Chromebooks over the course of 2 years. So it wasn't like I was in a one-to-one. This is like 2008 that I was doing this in the early stages. And literally just the addition of a device for a group and allowing them to collaborate and access information and do things they never could have done without that device totally changed the experience in my classroom. And I realized that I had been doing all of the heavy lifting in that room, and I had not been given them the opportunity to discover and explore and collaborate and talk to each other and make meaning together. And obviously the shift for me is why I'm still here and why I'm such an outspoken advocate of why we need to lean on technology strategically so we can make time for human connection in a classroom. Because the more we stand at the front of the room, transferring information, orchestrating those whole group lessons, the less time we actually have for human connection. Kids to connect with each other, us to connect with individuals in small groups, meeting their specific needs.
You mentioned this like tremendous sense of responsibility that teachers have. And oftentimes when you get up with that sense of responsibility, I think your natural reaction is to want to lead everything because there is that weight of responsibility on you to make sure certain things happen. I think what I'm hearing you say is when you were able to give some of that away really to the students, that's when you started to see a real change in the way people were engaging and really the impact of what you had intended to do in the first place, which was to get out there and to engage students and kind of help them find that creativity and that excitement for learning. If I'm a new teacher and I'm walking into the classroom, maybe for the first time, or even a veteran teacher, maybe who's just, not been at their best the last couple of years because it's been tough sledding, right? Yeah. What would you tell them about just, how to approach this and to make sure that this is something that really can empower you as an educator?
I think there are so many different ways that we can share this responsibility for learning with students. But if we can't figure out how to get out from the front of the classroom, then it's really hard to put student-led learning practices and these alternative instructional models into practice. So for me, the first step is really rethinking our approach to instruction. Because if we are delivering instruction live for a whole group of students in our class, whether it's a lecture or mini lesson, there are so many barriers that make it hard for students to take that information in and store it, to process it, to do anything with it, right? There are kids who might have hearing impairments, auditory processing, attention deficit. We have students who language might be a barrier, background knowledge might be a barrier, the pace of the information might be a barrier. And that's just if they're all in the room. And we know absenteeism is its own other big hurdle that school districts are dealing with right now. And so when we start to acknowledge, and this is what I wish all educators, new and veteran educators, were doing, is when we're designing learning experiences, always be asking ourselves, what are the potential barriers? What might make it challenging for a student to successfully acquire information, process information, execute a particular task? So when it comes to instruction, one of the very simple things that I ask teachers in coaching sessions is, are you going to say this the same way for everybody? Are you going to demonstrate this model the same way for everyone? And is it something you find yourself repeating or remodeling multiple times over a school year? Because in that case, it might make more sense to create an instructional video or find a piece of media that can transfer that information for you so that now we're shifting control over the pace of learning to the students. Maybe we build engagement around the media or the instructional video if we're scared, gosh, will that be effective for kids? And ask them to do a reciprocal teaching around multimedia where they're breaking it down with the aid of a group and their peers. And then that way, those explanations that are more nuanced, more complex, more challenging for students, we just know they've classically struggled with them. Then let's use something like station rotation to pull it into a small teacher-led differentiated instructional session where we can be much more intentional about how we're explaining, unpacking, modeling, supporting, guiding that experience. So for me, there's lots of things I want teachers to consider, but if we can't figure out how do we get out from in front of this class and actually create time to work with small groups, all of the other stuff is really hard to achieve.
I've heard you use this term before, and I really like it. I've stolen it, I think, a couple of times, right? But I'm just being honest. But teachers as architects of learning. Talk to me a little bit about that phrase and sort of the mind shift that has to go on in order to get there as an educator, because that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And for those of you who haven't seen my talk, I describe that, this really challenging moment in my life in 2017 when our family lost our home in a wildfire, just totally unexpected. And I was working with an architect to draw plans for the home we were going to rebuild. And it was in that interaction where, because I think of everything through the education lens, right? Because I've been in this work for so long. I was like, this is what teachers need to do, right? Because this architect sat across from me and really wanted to know who he was designing this home for. What were my family's needs and preferences? How did we use the space? And in a very similar way, I want teachers to think of themselves not just as designers, but as architects of student-centered learning experiences, really thinking about who are these kids in this class? What do they already know? What can they already do? What preferences or needs are in this class? What supports and scaffolds might they need to navigate the learning environment? And architect or create the structure of the lesson so that we're actually positioning the students to do the work. Because my architect never came to the building site and picked up a hammer to start building my house. It was the contractors and subcontractors. Yep. And we need to think of our students as those subcontractors, them building the meaning, them doing the heavy cognitive lift in classrooms so that they're the ones actually doing the learning, not just positioned as these passive receivers.
So I have read the book, The Shift to Student-Led, Catlin, and as I'm reading it, I'm thinking about blended learning as a discipline. And I think that when we talk about technology in classrooms, which is something that I wrote about for years, I think there's a difference between just putting technology in a classroom and then blended learning as a discipline. And although it seems obvious, I don't know if to administrators and others it always is. So talk to me about the difference between, technology-aided classrooms and blended learning.
Yeah, so there are technology-rich classrooms. There are technology-rich classrooms everywhere now, which is really exciting because of the increase in one-to-ones, COVID getting a lot more devices in kids' hands. We've got Chromebook carts or carts of whatever devices that students are using. But it doesn't mean that it's really impacting and elevating the learning experience. So you can use technology to just do what we've always done, but with technology, right? Instead of writing by hand, now we're typing. Instead of graphing on paper, we have tools to do that. When we talk about blended learning, the goal is to shift control over elements of the learning experience to the learner, which may not be happening in a technology-rich room, right? So we can use technology and teachers may never be differentiating instruction or personalizing instruction. Students might not have control over elements of their learning like place and pace and path. So for me, I always define for leadership, blended learning is simply active engaged learning online combined with active engaged learning offline with the goal of shifting more control to learners over those elements of their learning, time, place, pace, path. And so they might not control all of those things, or they're not going to control all of those things all the time, but the goal is to truly give them more control more of the time. So we are proactively removing barriers. We're also freeing teachers to better meet the needs of the diverse groups of classes that they teach, being able to pull individual and small groups for that differentiation, that personalized instruction. And so it is very different. And I think there are all of these misconceptions around blended learning. Like people hear that phrase and they associate it with COVID because that's when a lot of teachers heard it. That's bad news for me because nobody liked COVID. And so they're like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that. And I'm like, no, if we have technology in our classrooms, this is how we maximize the impact of technology. This is how we empower learners to drive the learning experience. If technology is simply used as a substitute for tools that were available before technology, then that investment in technology has not been a very wise one in terms of schools and districts. So for me, they're very different scenarios, but I think there's, again, all of these misconceptions that blended learning requires a hybrid schedule, it requires these special things. I'm like, no. 90% of the work I do is with schools where teachers are in traditional classrooms on traditional class periods, and we are using the rotation models to shift that control to students and free teachers to better meet the beautiful diversity of need in their classrooms.
So you can fit blended learning into really the model and the framework that you're already using. In fact, that's typically what you see when you go around schools. I think that's really an important piece. And, because it's difficult to kind of say, I want to do something entirely new. But I think when you can kind of step back and evaluate what you're already doing and then think about how new things and new frameworks, new processes, new learning models can fit into that, it becomes sort of much more manageable and doable. So I think that's a tremendous, that was an aha moment for me in hearing you talk about this. Let me ask you this. You just mentioned it. You've been all around schools, all over the country, and you've met with educators. You see them trying to implement things. You kind of bump up against the struggles that they're having. What are some of the things that districts or that schools get wrong about blended learning? What would you say or caution people to, if you see this, stop doing maybe?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of issues that I see when it comes to implementation. I think there are some misconceptions about teachers are doing their direct instruction session at the front of the room and then they're putting kids on computers and that's blended learning. And I'm like, okay, well, but do kids have control over any of these things? How is the teacher using their time? I'll go into schools that are piloting a particular model, like the station rotation model, but the teacher's saying the same thing the same way at the station, but now they're teacher led, but they're doing it 3 times for 3 different groups. And I'm like, that doesn't maximize the experience for the teacher or the learner. I think that when leadership is trying to figure out how do we maximize technology to elevate the learning experience, there really has to be messaging to teachers that it's okay to experiment. It's okay to fail. Like the early stages of trying anything new is a little rocky. And I think sometimes teachers feel so much pressure to be covering content. And there's this, directives from leadership to whatever their curriculum is. It's like, use it with fidelity. Well, if you're saying use your curriculum with fidelity and we want you to use blended learning, but your curriculum's written whole group teacher led, that doesn't work. And so oftentimes schools and districts bring me in because now they're trying to figure out, how do we utilize a curriculum that's written whole group, which PS it all still basically is, and then do it using these different instructional models that are technology enhanced that really are going to free teachers to provide the instruction and support that students actually need to make progress toward firm standard aligned goals. So I think sometimes there's not a real clear vision from leadership about how to implement blended learning, giving teachers permission to be the lead learner who is going to be experimenting and possibly hitting bumps and having challenges. And also, like, if you're doing any kind of full scale change on a campus or you're shifting from traditional teacher led to blended learning models, you also have to be thinking about how are you building professional learning into the fabric of your teachers' days and weeks at school, not isolated all staff trainings, but can you get teams of teachers working in professional learning communities so they can say, hey, I tried the playlist model and here was a bump I hit. I wasn't sure how to group people for offline tasks as they self-pace through the playlist. How do I do that? Like, they need to be able to lean on each other. They need time together to work and problem solve and collaborate and create. And so those are some of the bigger challenges that I see when I'm kind of working or hearing about districts making this shift. And it's not a shift that happens in 1 year. It is a journey, right? I'm still learning about blended learning, and I've been on this road for, almost 20 years.
I love that thought that it's a journey. Learning of any kind is a journey. And I think that students experience blended learning in the classrooms. We want them to be able to experience the benefits of that. But the instructor or the teacher also needs to understand blended learning and how they want to implement it for themselves in the context of their classroom. And they can only do that if they've practiced, if they've tried things, if they feel like they have a safe space to do that. And I do think that's one of those things, and I hear it over and over again because I'm always talking to people about new innovations in the classroom. And like, the ideas sound really good, but then people are like, well, how am I going to do that with all of the other things that I know that I have to do? And the fact that, like, maybe I'm a little scared to try something new because I don't want to stick my neck out or cause any problems. There's already, a lot of standards I have to meet and things that I'm pretty worried about.
Mm-hmm. But I think the more teachers are willing to be that lead learner, to try something new, tell kids, hey, I've never done this before. We're going to give it a try. We're going to see how it goes. We're going to debrief after. I'd love your feedback. Now, all of a sudden, we're creating spaces where it's a lot less scary for students to take a risk, potentially fail, have to take a step back and reimagine or iterate on something and try again, right? Like, we don't have to be perfect. And we need permission to be those lead learners. And I think for me, one of the things that has been so fascinating in my journey, so I've had the absolute honor of getting to write multiple books now with Dr. Novak. And really, I knew a bit about universal design for learning before we began collaborating, but obviously she is just an incredible thought partner and teacher for me in this space. But all of a sudden realizing that there are these ideals we have in education about making learning inclusive and accessible and equitable. So most people are bought into universal design because they value those things. But what I know is even though we value them, teachers don't always know how to put the principles of UDL into practice in their classrooms in an effective, consistent, and sustainable way. It can feel really overwhelming and unmanageable. And that is where this kind of marriage or this dynamic duo of blended learning and UDL becomes so powerful, because without UDL, blended learning can feel like maybe it results sometimes in shallow technology integration. And without blended learning, UDL can feel a little challenging to implement in a consistent way. But when you put them together, now you have the instructional technology enhanced models to release control, provide students agency, create those flexible pathways, and put universal design for learning into practice in these ways that feel sustainable once you get over the learning curve of the individual blended learning models.
Very cool. It's like if UDL is the building, the structure, right, then blended learning is sort of the engine, the boiler, all that stuff that can make it run really effectively. And that's a really very powerful sort of way of thinking about it. One sort of complements the other and how they work together. That's awesome. Let me ask you, again, you travel all over, and I know you get a chance to see this stuff working really well in schools. When you see it working really well, what's the feeling like in the schools? What's the feeling like in the classroom and with the teacher? I guess what I'm looking for is, again, we have this situation and we keep hearing about how people are just, they're disheartened, to say the least, about having to go into schools. They're stressed, they're overwhelmed. But if they could grasp onto something that kind of like reignites that passion that they got into education for in the first place, maybe that could be helpful. So that's kind of like what I'm looking for. Does this do that? And like, have you seen that happen?
I've experienced it, right? That's like why I'm here. And I think a lot of educators got into this profession for one of two reasons. They love kids and they want to ignite a love of learning in young people, and or they love their subject area. They are just such a math mind or a science person, or they love literature and they want to help other people love their discipline just like they love it. And you spend enough time in a classroom as a teacher with kids who don't seem all that interested in any of this, and it is really defeating. And we're doing most of the work in the traditional class. So we're up there trying to maintain attention, trying to make sure the behaviors are appropriate or whatever, like conducive to learning. And it's exhausting. And over time, it wears you down. And what we know about teacher engagement and student engagement is it's reciprocal motivational construct. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. So if we're spending years on end with groups of students who don't seem particularly interested in learning, right, our first goal, or our subject area, our second maybe area of focus, it's really defeating. And so then you get teachers who are frustrated and they're mad and they're disillusioned and they're tired. But when you start to release control to students and you start to set them up to lead the learning, ask questions, investigate through lenses of interest, work with their peers, learn how to unpack complex forms of media, have conversations, drive projects. I had this moment as a teacher where I was like, what have I been doing? Just Get out of their way. They are incredible. They are capable. Of course, they need my support and they need the structure and the guidance, but they don't need me to spoon feed them. They don't want that. And the more I gave them responsibility, the more I allowed them to drive the learning and position them to be that active agent. Sure, there was a beginning part at the beginning of the year. My kids were always like, what do you want us to do? Like, we're not used to working this hard in a classroom, but we always, a few weeks, a month and a half into the school year, they start to feel the difference. They start to recognize that they're enjoying class more, they're learning more, they're more connected to the people around them. And we create these like buzzing environments where students are curious and they're working and they're asking questions. And that's like where the magic happens, right? And I'm not to say it happens overnight, but it happens. And that's how we reignite our passion as educators for this, is really seeing our students enjoying learning, enjoying interacting with whatever our subject area or the content is.
I love that. It's like that students can surprise themselves. And then I think teachers can get surprised by just what students are truly capable of. I think that's awesome. I'd ask you this, because like, let's say, all right, I'm leaning in, right? Well, you know me, I've loved this stuff for a while, but if I'm new and I'm listening to this for the first time, I might be saying, I really want to do this. But I can't bite the whole apple at once, right? Like, where do I start? Like if I'm a new teacher, right, and I've just come in, we got new classrooms kicking off right now. Where do I start?
Well, if teachers are a little hesitant to like tackle, you don't tackle the whole blended learning puzzle at once. My suggestion would be start with a single instructional model. So maybe you are a teacher who's run classic centers in the past and you want to try the station rotation model, but now you're going to insert technology into a station to elevate that experience, to give students maybe more control over the pace at which they work, or to get students collaborating around a shared online task, or giving them personalized pathways for practice, and then really focusing on that teacher-led station and how you're going to adjust the instruction for each group. Or maybe you're a secondary teacher and you're like, ooh, I've never done rotations. I think some secondary teachers are like, oh, station rotation is an elementary model. No, it's not. Any class where there are kids with different skills and abilities and needs, that's a great model. But it might feel really like a stretch for a secondary teacher who's used to that lecture at the front of the room, followed by practice on paper. And so maybe then they're strategically kind of starting to flip their instruction, giving students opportunities to self-pace through videos, pulling individual learners or small groups who might, English might not be their first language and they want to provide a more scaffolded instructional session. Or maybe they're like, I use a lot of articles, kids don't seem to understand them at all. Now, all of a sudden, maybe we experiment with a student-led strategy like reciprocal teaching around an article, where we get kids together working to unpack that article and see if that's more successful. I mean, when I say that kids surprise you when you give them the opportunity to lead the learning, I'm not being hyperbolic, and I'll share just a quick example. So we started this conversation talking about my giving a TED Talk, which has been on my bucket list. But I was invited to the TED conference as an educator, probably back in 2016. And I was there to help them kind of develop their TED Ed curriculum as a teacher, giving feedback on it. And they said, anybody who wants to go back to classrooms and take our TED curriculum, we created a curriculum that walks kids through putting together a TED Talk, coming up with an idea, doing research, or like writing the talk and delivering it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I want to do that with my students. So I go back to my class. We spend a semester kind of weaving this into the other work that we're doing. And at the semester final, they all stood up. They gave their TED Talks. We recorded them, sent them off to TED. I get a call from TED like 4 months later. Hey, can you put us in touch with your student, Anna, who gave a TED Talk? And I said, sure, what's up? And they were like, we want to fly Anna and one of her parents from California to New York City to give her talk on the TED stage. Wow. So long before I ever took a TED Talk or gave a TED Talk, I had a student who delivered such an incredible talk that she landed on the TED stage. And it was just this reminder of like, they can do anything. We just have to believe in them and support them with the scaffolds and the instruction and the whatever they need to be successful, but they can do it.
Wow, that's great. And that's probably a great place for us to end this conversation. Before we do, I know you're putting something together a little bit later this year for folks who are interested in blended learning and sort of the journey that you've been on. Can you tell me a little bit about that event and how people can get involved?
Yeah. So usually people can only work with me if a school brings me in or a district brings me in. And so I've partnered with Rocket PD to offer a series all on blended learning, really with an eye on how do we leverage blended learning to universally design, to remove barriers, to ensure all students are making progress toward firm standard aligned goals. And so we're going to get into talking about the exact roles that we've mentioned today, breaking them down. How do you design for them? What does it look like to facilitate when students are moving through a station rotation, working through a playlist, watching a flipped video? And so the goal is really to help educators who want to change practice. What they're doing isn't working particularly well for them or their students. They have technology, but they don't feel like they're really maximizing the impact of that technology, to come join me for these synchronous, like live sessions where we can really dig into the why of blended learning, the how, unpacking these specific models and starting to design for your classes with those models. And then what's really great is there's like the collaboration, because people join from all over the world. And so you have educators in breakout rooms having conversations, designing together. It's just such a really wonderful experience for me to get to work with teachers who I might never have had the chance to work with before.
Well, that's exciting. I know, folks, if you are listening to this, I will drop the link in the comments. If you're watching this, I will drop the link in the comments. If you're listening, you can go to rocketpd.com to check that out. Catlin, I just want to say thanks again for chatting with me for a few minutes. It's been exciting to get to hear the journey that you've been on, not only in the last 20 years, but just in the last couple of weeks, and having gotten to deliver a TED Talk and do some exciting things. People are sitting up, they're paying attention. This is a great place to be, and I'm just excited to get to chat with you about it. So thanks. I hope we can have you back again real soon.
I'd love that. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rocket PD Podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the Rocket PD Podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for Rocket PD. At Rocket PD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at rocketpd.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.